The following scenario is hypothetical and presented for educational and entertainment purposes. The sky is not a frontier, it is a painted ceiling, a heavy dome of celestial brass that has stifled human ambition for 1,000 years. In this world, the horizon does not beckon, it warns. Because humanity refused to let the earth move, the stars remained mere pinpricks of light in a divine tapestry, motionless and subservient. This isn't a world of grand discoveries, but one of maintenance. Scholars spend their lives polishing the great truth, the belief that we are the unmoving anchor of all existence. But this cosmic ego comes with a devastating price. Without the realization that we are drifting through a vast, interconnected void, our science has become a stagnant pool. We didn't learn to harness the wind because we didn't understand why it blew. We didn't conquer the seas because we feared the edges of a world that was never meant to be a sphere in motion. The air itself feels thick with the dust of old parchment and the stubborn refusal to look up with honest eyes. Inside the smog-choked cities, life is a frantic cycle of localized industry. Without the global synchronization that comes from understanding a rotating planet, every city lives in its own fractured pocket of time. Communication is a mess of tangled wires and carrier pigeons, as the concept of a signal bouncing off the heavens is dismissed as a ghost story. The great empires rule by the mandate of the center, using the Earth's supposed stillness to justify a rigid, unchanging social hierarchy. If the Earth does not move, why should the people? Progress is seen as a form of heresy, a vibration that threatens to upset the perfect stagnant equilibrium of the Emperor's footstool. Yet beneath the cobblestones and the cathedrals, something is beginning to groan. Deep in the restricted vaults of the Imperial Archives, a young archivist named Elara discovers a series of forbidden star charts hidden behind a false wall. These are not the official maps of perfect circles and divine alignment. They are messy, chaotic, and filled with wobbles that the Academy has spent centuries erasing. As she traces the jagged lines of a planet that refuses to stay in its assigned path, she feels a strange, terrifying sensation. A faint tilt in her inner ear. A whisper of momentum. For the first time in a millennium, the ground beneath the capital doesn't feel like a foundation. It feels like a cage. And as she looks out her narrow window at the fixed North Star, she notices a flicker that isn't supposed to be there. The star is drifting, slipping away from the center of the world. The crack in the North Star was only the beginning of a silent, terrifying unraveling. In this world of the center, time was not a universal constant, but a localized decree, enforced by massive steam-powered clock towers that loomed over every capital city. These towers were designed to keep the world in sync with a stationary Earth, their heavy brass pendulums swinging in a vacuum of tradition. But as Elara watched from the shadows of the archives, the great clock of the Imperial Square began to lag. It wasn't a mechanical failure, it was a cosmic one. The gears were grinding against a reality they were never built to endure. The great stationary truth was being physically challenged by a momentum that had been suppressed for 1,000 years, and the friction was starting to generate heat that scorched the very air. In the markets below, the people felt it too, a subtle, nauseating shift in their inner balance. Trade slowed as the heavy shortwave towers, the lifeline of the Empire's fragmented communication, began to emit a low, mournful hum. Without the understanding of a rotating planet, the engineers couldn't explain why their signals were suddenly drifting, why a message sent to the northern colonies was being swallowed by a ghost frequency. To the Academy, this was a disturbance of the ether, a spiritual impurity to be purged with prayer and more coal. But to the workers in the deep mines, the earth was literally groaning. The deep tectonic plates, which in our world shift and slide under the influence of a spinning core, were here locked in a jagged, unnatural embrace. The stress of 1,000 years of denied motion was building toward a singular, explosive release. Elara's forbidden maps revealed a pattern that the official histories had burned: the Great Erasures. Every few centuries, the stars would begin to wander, and the Empire would reset the heavens, rewriting the charts and executing anyone who noticed the discrepancy. She realized she was living through the final reset. The stars weren't just flickering, they were streaking. The fixed lamps of the night were revealing themselves to be distant suns, and the Earth was finally slipping out of its imaginary anchor. The social order, built on the absolute stillness of the ground, began to fracture. If the Earth could move, then the Emperor's throne was just a chair on a rock, and the rigid walls of the class system were nothing more than shadows. As the sun began to set on the longest day of the year, it didn't dip below the horizon with its usual practiced grace. It seemed to wobble, hanging in the sky like a heavy, golden weight that had suddenly lost its tether. The birds stopped singing, and a localized wind, hot and smelling of ozone, began to whip through the narrow streets, blowing from a direction that didn't exist on any imperial compass. Elara clutched her stolen charts to her chest as the first great spire of the clock tower groaned and snapped, the massive brass gears tumbling into the streets like the teeth of a dying god. The world was no longer standing still, and the first true gale of a moving world was about to scream through the silence of the ages. The collapse of the Great Clock Tower was the starting gun for a reality that had forgotten how to breathe. As the brass gears shattered against the cobblestones, the very sensation of down began to play tricks on the human mind. In a world where the Earth was an immovable anchor, gravity was taught as a static blessing, a heavy hand keeping everything in its rightful place. But as the planet's true ancient momentum began to bleed through the Empire's artificial dampeners, people found themselves stumbling toward the east, pushed by a phantom force they had no name for. The air, once stagnant and heavy with the scent of coal smoke, was suddenly torn apart by a vertical gale. Without the knowledge of how a rotating sphere holds its atmosphere, the Empire watched in horror as the sky itself seemed to thin, the clouds stretching into long, jagged ribbons of white fire. In the coastal provinces, the divine stillness of the oceans vanished in a single, terrifying heartbeat. The sea had always been treated as a flat, obedient basin, but now the water began to bulge and retreat in ways that defied every imperial prayer. Massive walls of water, driven by a centrifugal surge that had been suppressed for centuries, rose like mountain ranges on the horizon. These weren't storms. They were the planet's tides finally reclaiming their natural rhythm, unburdened by the Academy's chemical stabilizers. Port cities that had stood for 1,000 years were swallowed in minutes, not by waves, but by a rising ocean that seemed to have forgotten where the shore was supposed to be. The global communication grid, the fragile web of copper wires and shortwave towers, snapped under the strain of a world that was literally growing wider at its waist. Elara fled the burning archives, her stolen maps, the only compass in a world that had lost its north. She saw the high priests of the Academy standing on their balconies, screaming at the sun to return to its path, but the sun was no longer listening. It hung bloated and distorted in the midday sky. Its light filtered through an atmosphere that was being reshaped by supersonic winds. The etheric dampeners, the massive subterranean gyroscopes that the government had used to mask the Earth's vibration, were failing one by one, their explosions shaking the crust like the footsteps of a giant. Each time a dampener died, a new layer of the great truth was stripped away, revealing a universe that was vast, cold, and utterly indifferent to the Emperor's decrees. The social fabric didn't just tear, it vaporized. When the ground is no longer a fixed foundation, the laws built upon it become meaningless. Riots broke out, but they were strangely quiet, as people were too busy trying to keep their balance on a world that was starting to spin. Elara reached the edge of the capital's great plateau and looked out over the valley. In the distance, she could see the great orreries, the massive mechanical models of a geocentric universe being torn apart by their own weight. The heavy iron planets, which had revolved around a central Earth for generations, were being flung outward by the very forces they were built to deny. Just as she turned to find shelter, the sky turned a deep, impossible violet, and a shadow larger than any continent began to crawl across the sun, marking the arrival of a celestial body that the imperial charts claimed did not exist. The violet sky was not a dawn, but the bruising of the atmosphere as it collided with the raw solar wind, no longer shielded by the Empire's artificial etheric shell. The shadow creeping across the sun belonged to Jupiter, the Great Wanderer, now visible to the naked eye as a terrifyingly massive orb. For a millennium, the Academy had taught that Jupiter was a minor spark, a mere decoration on a crystal sphere. But as the Earth's forced stillness failed, the giant's true gravity began to tug at the world's very marrow. The ground did not just shake, it rippled like silk. Mountains that had stood as symbols of eternal stability groaned and slumped, their foundations liquefied by the sudden reassertion of the planet's natural centrifugal bulge. The Earth was trying to return to its true shape, an oblate spheroid, and it was tearing through the rigid, flat architecture of the geocentric era to do it. Elara stood at the edge of the world's end, watching as the great orreries finally disintegrated. The massive iron Earth at the center of the Imperial machine snapped its chains and was flung into the sky, a poetic mirror of the reality unfolding around her. The stationary truth was dead. In its place was a terrifying, beautiful kineticism. People were no longer falling, they were floating or being crushed. As the localized gravity fields the Empire had spent centuries maintaining flickered and died, the air was filled with the sound of a billion bells, the resonance of the Earth's core finally spinning at its natural frequency. Without the dampeners, the planet's rotation was a scream that shattered glass and bone alike. The Emperor's palace, the literal center of the world, collapsed into its own shadow, proving that even the most divine decree cannot hold back a planet that wants to turn. As the atmosphere thinned, the stars did not wait for night to appear. They burned through the violet haze, cold and infinite. Elara looked at her charts. The jagged, messy lines were now the only things that made sense. The Earth was not a throne. It was a ship, a tiny, fragile vessel traveling at 30 kilometers per second through a void that was far larger and more beautiful than any priest had dared to imagine. She saw the sun, not as a golden servant, but as a roaring nuclear furnace, the true master of the dance. The realization was both a horror and a liberation. The world was ending. Yes, but the universe was finally beginning. The smaller, darker world of the Empire was being swallowed by a reality of light and motion that demanded everything but offered the truth in return. The final surge came not from the sea or the wind, but from the light itself. As the Earth settled into its new chaotic orbit, the first true day began. A day measured by the planet's own spin, not a clockmaker's gear. Elara closed her eyes as the horizon rushed up to meet the sun at a speed that felt like flight. The Great Reset was over, but there would be no more rewriting of charts. The survivors, if there were any, would grow up in a world where the ground moved, where the stars were distant destinations, and where the center of the universe was wherever one had the courage to stand. The silence that followed the collapse was not the silence of death, but the bated breath of a world that had finally, after 1,000 years of holding its breath, begun to turn.